Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to our session on entrepreneurs and COVID-19. And the session today is really kind of trying to give you some tips and tricks of how you can deal with the stresses that COVID-19 causes for many of us, but as you'll hear in our talk, particularly for you as entrepreneurs. And I'm actually gonna hand over to my colleague Cemek, who is gonna do the first part of the presentation. And I just want to acknowledge that this is a seminar that we're doing at King's Business School together with the King's Entrepreneurship Institute, and the research we're somehow drawing on is funded by the European Union. Okay, so over to you, Cemek.
Thanks very much, Uta. So welcome everyone. My name is Przemek Zbierowski, and together with Uta Stefan and Pierre-Jean Anat, we are going to run the seminar today. So, the seminar, the webinar is going to be about dealing with stress and how to stay resilient and regain control, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, but more broadly about any crisis. So just to briefly introduce ourselves, why we think this is our responsibility to talk about this and to deliver this webinar to you. So first of all, Uta is a leading researcher in well-being of entrepreneurs, maybe not only about well-being of entrepreneurs, but about on well-being in general. She has a PhD in psychology and is a professor of entrepreneurship at King's Business School, King's College London, and honorary professor at UCL and Aston Business School. Pierre-Jean has a lot of practical perspective. He's a two-time entrepreneur and advisor to entrepreneurs, but also researcher of entrepreneurs' mental health and well-being, and lecturer and tutor in entrepreneurship. And myself, I'm currently a research fellow at the King's Business School. Together with Uta and Pierre-Jean, we're running a project that is called Positive Entrepreneurship. For good, I'm based in Poland and Katowice, and I'm also advisor to entrepreneurs. I have supported over 100 entrepreneurs on various stages of their ventures. So I've seen a bit on the impact of entrepreneurship on well-being. So just to give you a short overview of what we will be talking about. So first of all, I'm going to talk about broadly about well-being and about stressors. So what is well-being? What do we mean by this? What do we mean by stress? And what kind of resources and drains of entrepreneurs' well-being we can talk about? Then we are going to break for session on questions and answers. And by the way, we are in a webinar mode, so you won't be able, I'm sorry, to ask questions vocally. Please put them in the chat box, in the chat function as we go along. And Pierre-Jean is going to collect them and convey the questions during the question and answers session. And then I'm going to hand over to Uta, who will talk more specifically about stress and resilience and well-being of entrepreneurs during the COVID-19 pandemic. So about acknowledging stress, detaching, recovering, seeking social support, improvising, and planning. So first of all, what is well-being and what is happiness? If we go by the definition of World Health Organization, then health, and not only mental health, but also physical health, is not just the lack of the absence of disease, but it's a state of well-being. So it's about realizing our full potential. It's about being able to cope with stressors in life, working productively, and being able to contribute to the community. So it's more about thriving. And the best way to look at it is to see that as a continuum, where on one end we have serious mental disorder, on the other hand we have, let's call it full happiness, something that we call eudaimonic happiness. And going from the left, mental disorder is something clinically diagnosed, and if you have a depression, it's really impossible sometimes to work productively or to work at all, to get out of the bed. A little bit less impairment of life and social function is a psychological distress or strain, or something that we more commonly called stress. And this is a very normal and very natural reaction and experience that we experience from time to time. We will talk about this in a minute, that is natural and it's something to mobilize our reactions. And then if we go to the well-being part, it's first we have happy and content well-being, which is just about feeling good. But if we move to the right, we have, let's call it a deeper and stronger well-being that is called optimal functioning or eudaimonic well-being or psychological well-being, in which state we are energetic because we do something that we like. It's not only about feeling good, but it's about having a good life and being absolutely aware that we are living a good life and it makes us happy and we are vital and energetic. So it's about thriving and what positive psychology calls it flourishing. So why talk about this in general? I think if you hear it's just because you're looking for well-being and happiness. And I think it's very relevant right now, especially for entrepreneurs, because entrepreneurs are heavily exposed to what is happening right now, so to the crisis and to the COVID-19 pandemic. And the research that we're just carrying on says that about 80% of businesses have a drop in the turnover. So it's a very high exposure. And also well-being in general, not only of entrepreneurs, but of the general population is affected by the pandemic. And if you are an entrepreneur, so it means that your well-being has double exposure. So because you're an entrepreneur and it's about well-being, so it's quite relevant. And it's important for entrepreneurs, well-being, not just for the sake of well-being, but it's one of the success criteria. So entrepreneurs run their businesses also because they want to be happy. And there is a very strong connection for all people, but for entrepreneurs especially, between work life and private life. So there's a very strong spillover effect of work satisfaction to personal well-being. And also there is a pretty strong effect, a spillover effect, a crossover effect from entrepreneurs to their life partners. And well-being, it's not only just the purpose in itself for entrepreneurs, but it is also reflected in what entrepreneurs are doing. So there is evidence that businesses of happy entrepreneurs just perform better, partly because they have a better ability to recognize opportunities, to improve market offerings, to change or to create new products and services because they have broader scope. And there is also happy entrepreneurs have also higher persistence because they're very, very energetic. So that also helps them to overcome obstacles. And if I give you some practical examples that well-being is important. So this is Ludo. Ludo is an entrepreneur that actually cooperates with us, and his business idea is actually framed around well-being of entrepreneurs. So his business idea is to preserve physical and mental well-being of entrepreneurs. He provides some services of psychologists, coaches, nutritionists, personal trainers to entrepreneurs, but not only to entrepreneurs, but also to venture capitalists and business angels, because well-being of entrepreneurs is important not only for entrepreneurs themselves, but also for people who invest in them. And this is experience that I also get from Poland. I speaking to business angels, they are concerned that well-being of entrepreneurs is sometimes in danger from the external circumstances. And also there is a case of Pete Wilkins, who used to be an entrepreneur, and he experienced burnout and being obsessed with his business activity. And then later on becoming an investor, his very big concern is the well-being of the people, of the entrepreneurs that he invests in. So also for venture capitalists and business angels, it is important that the people they work with have high well-being. So it's well-being is also practical in terms of perspective, from funding perspective. So if we talk about well-being, is the first step and the main step is probably to recognize the resources and drains. to well-being, and so to discover what makes us happy and what makes us unhappy. And we could have a very practical exercises for this, but this is a webinar, so it's probably best if you just take the slide deck later on, and you might be willing to reflect on this and find your own, because this is very person specific, to find your own drivers and drains of happiness and well-being. So it is very important to recognize resources and drains to well-being, because it's the imbalance between those two that produces stress. And it has to be said that stress is something that is very natural and actually important in our lives. This is an evolutionary thing, and it's there so the body mobilizes energy to respond to threats by cortisol, by adrenaline. So it's very useful. The problem arises when we experience stress over a long period of time, and the stress is too high. And if you look at this small graph here, it shows that energy mobilization is a good thing. So if you have no stimuli, no incentive, then you become inactive and bored. And there are some sensory deprivation experiments that show that. On the other hand, if you have too much and for a long period of time, you become anxious and overwhelmed. So what is important is that there is some kind of point in the middle where your stimulation is just optimal for your functioning. So speaking of resources and drains of well-being, there are two main categories that we are going to talk about. So the first is the nature of your work, which is very special for entrepreneurs, and also is the finance and also resources for well-being. So in terms of resources that have very strong impact, generally work of entrepreneur has very strong impact on well-being, because you spend long hours at work. And the first and probably one of the most important resource for well-being of entrepreneurs is autonomy. Autonomy, which is the feeling of control over what, when, and with whom we're doing. And this is something that entrepreneurs, I think, sometimes forget about, because they forget how it is not to experience autonomy at work. So sometimes we take it for granted, but it's very important, and it's a strong predictor, for example, for the life expectancy. The second that you probably also feel is meaningfulness. So the more meaning we find in our work, the more happy we are. And I think meaningfulness in entrepreneurial work relates to two things. And the first is that we entrepreneurs create something very specific and very tangible, and this is the enterprise. So this is something that entrepreneurs identify with very strongly, and it gives a very strong sense of meaning. And the other source for meaningfulness is that when we experience and when we observe a positive impact of our work as entrepreneurs on lives of other people. So the prosocial motivation can be a very strong driver of happiness. And finally, very strong driver and resource of well-being is the variety of tasks. Research shows that it's not only the outcome of entrepreneurial work that is important and is a driver of well-being, but it's also a process. So the work is very interesting, and there are a variety of activities that entrepreneurs are performing. So those resources are very important, but they need protection. So sometimes, for example, autonomy protected for being overwhelmed. So it's sometimes a good thing to delegate some tasks. In terms of meaningfulness, is always very good to relate to a bigger picture. And in terms of variety, you have to find a balance between doing one thing or many things, because sometimes you also get overwhelmed. So unfortunately, apart from the resources, there are also drains for entrepreneurs' well-being. And probably the stronger one is that it's a very high workload and long working hours. The other is that there is often little social support from the people around us. And finally, there is this too much of a good thing experience that sometimes we have too much autonomy, too much meaningfulness, and the variety is just too high. So if we have too much autonomy, we are overwhelmed by information. Sometimes there is a very high uncertainty. So sometimes we are not certain what kind of decision we should take. If our job is too meaningful, then there is a risk of getting into obsession or even addiction, especially when our emotional attachment to the business is high, and if there is too much variety in what we're doing in our activities, we also experience a loss of component of eudaimonic well-being that is called environmental mastery, and that can be perceived, especially at the beginning when you start up a business. You are overwhelmed by a very wide variety of tasks that you have to perform, and especially that most of them are in what we call the controlled part of attention. So research also shows that the well-being of entrepreneurs at the beginning is lower and then rises as we develop our companies. So if we go back to the resources just for a little while from the eudaimonic perspective, then apart from those that we talked about, there are 3 more that are worth mentioning. So the first one is self-acceptance. So first of all, it's about being aware of ourselves, and then about accepting not only our strengths, but also our dark sides, so our weaknesses, and also positive view of our past life. And for entrepreneurs, self-acceptance is again very strongly linked to the success or failure of the business, as this is a very big part of our or identity of entrepreneurs. And the other one is personal growth, and this is something that is I think very common for entrepreneurs, as there is a very high variety of tasks that then there is a very fast and strong learning process. So it's something you experience that you are growing over time. And finally, positive relationships with others, which is probably the strongest predictor. There was a research project at Harvard University for 75 years. And the main result is that the positive relations with others is the strongest predictor of happiness and well-being in the long run. Sometimes, unfortunately, for entrepreneurs, business activity sometimes harms positive relations with others. For some reason, speaking to entrepreneurs, they very often say that when they started the business, they lost their friends and they gain new friends. So there is a very strong effect on social relationships. Sometimes it means that you're working long hours, so there is a harm for family life. So this is again something that should be protected. And very important for entrepreneurs is also the financial situation. So this is one of the biggest also drains for entrepreneurs. What is especially harmful is that there is very often a very chronic lack of funding for entrepreneurs. And also, I said before, that entrepreneurs and businesses are very exposed. So when we have a crisis like this at the moment, entrepreneurs are especially under shock and crisis, and that threatens the identity again, because that's very strongly connected to the business. So sometimes what entrepreneurs feel and think that this is something that this is because of me, while sometimes it doesn't, because it's just about some external circumstances caused by the crisis. So sometimes there is guilt because we are also responsible, entrepreneurs are also responsible for stakeholders, mainly employees. On the upside is that if you're successful, so if your financial situation is good, then it's again very strong driver of well-being. So you experience very positive emotions. So being an entrepreneur can be seen this perspective as some kind of magnifier of the effect of external conditions on our well-being. And I think we're gonna break here and hand over to you, to the questions from you, and to the Pierre-Jean, who will manage the question and answer session. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box, questions or comments, something that you might be willing to express, something, how it relates to your personal experiences as the entrepreneur. Okay, no questions yet. So maybe if we have no questions for now, I think Ute, I will hand over to you, and maybe there will be some questions at the end, maybe to both parts of the session, and maybe to more specific issues that about the crisis that you will present now.
Hold on a second. There is now just a question. Okay. What can be done to improve well-being?
Mm-hmm. There are certain things that you can do, especially to enhance those drivers of well-being. So, for example, to enhance meaningfulness, it's very important, and also what is connected to this is autonomy. So, first of all, what is very good is reflecting on the purposes on goals of the business. It's also very important from the perspective of autonomy to have something that you can call internal autonomy, so that you're not doing something that people expect from you and from your business, but you're doing something that you really like and you really want. And that will give you, if you fulfill that objectives that you think are yours, then you gain a very strong feeling of meaningfulness that should boost well-being. It's also about balancing. So it's also, first of all, it's about being aware. So being aware, what are the drivers, or what are your specific personal drains of well-being, and to manage them specifically. And it's also probably about the variety of things. So sometimes you get overwhelmed. So maybe sometimes it's a good thing to delegate, or if you have business partners, to share with them, to share some responsibilities, to recognize what are you strong at, and maybe to do this, and maybe delegate or leave what you're not so good at to your business partners. I can see the other questions. Are there studies especially for entrepreneurs? And I think that's probably a question that Ute will be better able to answer.
So yes,
kinks.
Yeah, so what we presented to you is really based on research on entrepreneurs, and it's a very good question, because what we do see is that entrepreneurs' well-being is both more threatened, if you want, compared to employees, because there's so many more stressors. But you also have unique kind of resources for your well-being. So the autonomy, for instance, or the meaningfulness of your work, these are things that are hardly available to the same extent to employees. But we'll discuss a bit more about this in the next section.
Is that a question, Karina, is that a question about specific programs of studies for entrepreneurs that are maybe available at King's? I know it's a one-way communication, but maybe you can sort of guide us in the chat box of what did you specifically mean by this? Okay, yeah, if you're referring to loneliness, that is something that we have seen during our research. We're actually doing a project now on well-being in times of pandemic that Ute will say a few words at the end. So yeah, it's good to relate to people, even though sometimes we work from home and we work alone. But there are things like this, so sometimes you relate on whatever, Skype, Zoom, and I'm sure that even though you work at home, there's probably some opportunity to relate to other people, and we should probably use those opportunities as much as possible. I mean, it's not ideal, again, it's better to have strong and direct relationships, but given the situation, it's probably better to socialize using the infrastructure that we have available.
Yes, can Karina just add that she's familiar with the review, that she appreciates, but she's missing the practical implication for entrepreneurs.
So we'll get to that, I think, in the second part more specifically, but good question. So if you hear noise in the background, I apologize. The window cleaner just came. So this is the beauty of working somewhere else. Shall I maybe just go into the second part then, because some of the questions were around what specifically can you do. So just to remind you, so what we've learned in the first part is well-being is really important, and it's a really big asset both for your productivity and the longevity of your business. And so it's something that needs protecting, and which is difficult to protect at the best of times because of the long working hours, the loneliness, and all the stresses that come with being an entrepreneur. But it's particularly difficult to protect that in times of crisis. And so I want to kind of talk a bit about what you can do. So just to remind ourselves, not that we need reminding, but we are in the middle of a global health crisis, a pandemic, and that's a stressful situation along several dimensions. It's really uncertain. Nobody can really tell us what life will look like in half a year, in a year. It also takes away control over our life. So when we said that autonomy is something really important, especially for entrepreneurs, it's about being in charge and being able to mold things your way. And so if that's taken away, that's hard for all of us, but particularly for entrepreneurs like you. It's even, we've talked about the issue around loneliness, and the pandemic has the effect of kind of even further curtailing social relationships. It threatens the survival of many enterprises, and because the enterprises you lead are often very closely intertwined with your own livelihood and those of your family, then the amount of threat is even bigger, and it may also very practically threaten the health, your own health and that of your loved ones. And there's many more aspects, but these are possibly the kind of the key issues. And so now that I've made you feel miserable, I'm sure, talking about all those threats, so how can you deal with this? And so when we think about dealing with any type of adversity, economic downturns, it doesn't take long to come to the concept of resilience. So resilience is the idea that even if there is a shock, like if you see here the current pandemic, then somehow things get worse before they get better. But the idea of resilience is that you can bounce back from shocks, from adversity, from crisis, and actually that you can bounce back in a way that you may be even, that your business may be even more thriving, and you might be even more thriving than you've done before the crisis. It's important to be, when we talk about resilience, some people see resilience purely as something that you're born with, but I don't want to be talking about that because there's very little you can do about that maybe. But actually what we know from recent research is really that how you handle the stressful period that comes with a crisis, that's really how you build resilience, and that's really what makes resilience. So it's something very practically that you can learn, and it depends on what you do. And there's really two parts. The first part of dealing with crisis is the experience of the disruption. So when things go downhill, so to speak. And I want to talk about how you deal with that stress. And then more time I want to spend on what you can do practically in terms of coping efforts to mitigate stress and also to reestablish control in this very uncertain situation. And so, let's delve into stress. So what I'm saying may sound very basic, but it's actually quite important. So we've heard already that stress is a quite normal response to any threat, any crisis. It's important to bear in mind that it's a physiological response. So there's only so much you can control when you feel overwhelmed, anxious, maybe even hopeless. Because it's physiological and it's hardwired in a way, what is important is to acknowledge that the situation is stressful. So what we see is that the first step towards building resilience is really to kind of if you want, face reality, acknowledge it's a very difficult situation, because that then makes space to kind of engage in coping mechanisms. And I guess I want to reinforce the message that it's not you, it's the pandemic. So entrepreneurs often, because you're very achievement driven, you build your own business, you're in charge all the time, it seems really easy to say when things go downhill that it's, possibly your fault, but actually it's not, because everybody's in trouble at the moment. And so, in terms of acknowledging stress, a little bit of detachment is really quite important. And so once you've kind of accepted the adversity, it kind of frees up mental space to think about how you can deal with it. Because when you're kind of still, if you want, consider, oh, why are things so bad at the moment, and dwell on this, that takes up valuable resources, mental resources that you could better utilize for other things. And so it's also this self-compassion, right? To make space for yourself to realize, yes, these are difficult times, and yes, I might not be as productive as I would usually be. And it's kind of making sure that you don't even expect from yourself that you have the same level of productivity. So that's what all accepting stress means, really. And so what could you do very kind of practically? As I said, stress and this feeling of threat is a bit of a hardwired response. And so it's kind of important when you are feeling that you start to be overwhelmed and there's this sense of dread building, actually continuing to work in that sort of emotional state isn't very productive, because you're too consumed by your emotions. So it's better to take a break, maybe go out in the garden. I should say this is unfortunately not my garden, but a very beautiful garden. And what's also helpful is kind of simple breathing exercises. And you see one here, so where you inhale and exhale for a certain amount of time. And why is breathing good? Because breathing, actually, this type of breathing exercise relaxes your body. It kind of has an impact on your vagus nerve. So you're actually kind of getting a bit of control of this physiological stress response. So managing stress, the first element. And then, as I said, there's 3 kind of very specific things you can do to cope with stress and kind of help your sense of control to help and reestablish that sense of control. So the first step is really to make time for recovery from stress. And that's true in the best of times. Again, we've heard entrepreneurs' work is very hard, very intense, very long hours. And that means that basically, in physiological terms, there is a kind of stress response building up. And that can be quite dangerous. We see study after study that if this physiological buildup of the stress response isn't reset every once in a while, people literally become ill, both mentally and physically, and also die earlier. So, and this is recovery from stress is quite simple, but it's something that we need to build into our routines to not forget about it, because it's easy to just carry on working when actually you should take a step back and should take a break and give yourself space to recovery to ensure that in the longer term you stay energetic and healthy. And we know that this is particularly a challenge for entrepreneurs, because when recovery is most needed, so when you really most should make time for a break, you're least likely to feel that you have this time, because work is so intense and you just feel you should power on. So here are a few things you can do. One thing is to detach mentally, so literally stop thinking about work. I realize it's easier said than done, but little routines help here a great deal. One is to set yourself a deadline when you stop working in the evening, which also helps with sleep hygiene and allows you to sleep better. And another one is just kind of introducing mini breaks throughout the day. So there's a lot of research, both from a stress and health standpoint, but also from a productivity standpoint, that it's actually much better to work in short breaks, so in short segments of time, and then give yourself a 5-minute break. There's various apps to support this, which we can share. But the idea is basically that if you work, let's say 50 minutes, and and you train yourself, get into the routine that there will be a break after these 50 minutes, you'll be working much more focused for those 50 minutes. And then you give yourself this break to kind of relax and kind of get a bit of distance between yourself. You could use this break to form social connections, so you could chat to somebody, which, kind of bridging the loneliness a bit. But even just going into the garden or doing something else, walking around, getting a bit of physical activity are very good strategies. And you'll be surprised once you get back to work, you might have a lot more creative ideas, because this kind of detaching from our work actually helps our brain to kind of make new connections. Then physical exercise. Depends, some people are more keen on physical exercise, others not. So you kind of have to work out what works for you. But the evidence says, whether you like it or not, and I'm not a big physical exercise person myself, regular exercise is extremely good to manage stress and to kind of enhance your well-being. The rule of thumb is roughly 30 minutes per day. That's moderate exercise. So walking briskly somewhere would count towards that. And then, a bit more is obviously better. But again, if you are, especially these times when you're working from home, you might not get as much exercise because you're not walking to work or things like that. Kind of try and build that into your routine. It's easier if it's part of our routine. We are much less likely to forget it, because we are, after all, animals of habit as human beings. And also set yourself achievable goals. So if you don't do any exercise now, don't expect yourself to do, don't set yourself a goal to do 30 minutes a day next week. Maybe, 1 day a week, and then you build it up 2 days a week, 3 days a week, and so forth. The other, and that's a quite recent study, very large scale study, that showed that if we spend at least 2 hours per week in nature, it actually literally changes our physiological makeup. So the stress response, cortisol, epinephrine, and all of these indicators are reset. So, and obviously that can be easily combined with physical exercise, but yeah, spending time in nature. If you can't go out at the moment, even the garden can be helpful. Here, if you're lucky enough to have a garden, that is, of course. And then one of the really big areas to make sure to reset and recover from stress, kind of deal with these long hours, is sleep. And you may be familiar with the pattern that, when you don't get enough sleep, you work, but you're tired, you're not very productive. And then what happens at the end of the day, when you go to sleep, you wake up in the middle of the night worrying about work, or you find it much more difficult to fall asleep. So all these things, I'm aware, take time, and you might feel, again, coming back to this recovery paradox, when we need recovery most, we're least likely to engage in this. So don't just see it as something that kind of helps you with the stress in the here and now. See it also as a long-term investment. And again, as I said, it's not just good for your well-being, it's also really good to be more creative, and kind of helps your productivity in the end as well. And this is just a little screenshot of a study we did, where we actually found we tend to think of creativity as something that's fixed as a trait. Well, actually what we found is that creativity of entrepreneurs was much more strongly predicted by sleep quality. So if you sleep better, you're much more creative the next day. So the other aspect I said is sleep, getting a good night's sleep. If you don't regularly get a good night's sleep, you're not alone. Sleep problems are one of the most common mental health problems. And here, just some tips and tricks. They're very generic, but again, it's about building routines. So going to bed and waking up the same time every day, including weekends. Make sure you get at least 7 hours of sleep, but I would really caveat that as how much sleep you need is very individual. So I actually ended up buying myself one of these activity and sleep tracker watches, and found out that I need a lot more sleep than I thought I would, because the feedback was that basically I thought I got 8 hours, but I didn't. So things like that help you. Establishing relaxing routines. The bedroom is supposed to be only for sleep and sex, which means when you are having problems falling asleep or wake up in the night, don't try and spend time lying there. Get actually up, do something else, so that, again, it's kind of this routine and habit coupling, that when you see your bed, you kind of feel tired, and now your body knows now it's time for sleep. what I would say, there's obviously, I'm sure you're familiar with this, so don't drink too much, don't eat a big meal, caffeine in the afternoon even can disrupt your sleep, no bright lights and so forth. What I would say is, now that I've built it up and said you really ought to get enough sleep, there could be a pressure, right, that you feel, oh, when I now wake up in the night, I know I don't get enough sleep and that's going to hamper my productivity and it's going to be bad for me going forward. Well, at that point in time, I would say do a breathing exercise that helps. Also kind of try and use mind stop techniques. So literally imagining, as silly as it may sound, but literally imagine a stop sign. And then what this helps to do is refocus your thoughts on something that kind of allows you to detach from your worries and instead kind of clears your mind. But also, we're very sure that every once in a while getting a bad night's sleep is not particularly problematic. Our body can deal with that. It's more over the long run whether you regularly get enough sleep. So recovery is one aspect. So make time for being away from work and make this a routine in various ways. The second aspect that we know helps with resilience is really seeking support. And I realize this can be a challenge, especially now when, you know, we're kind of socially distancing. But also what we see is for entrepreneurs, this seeking support seems to be extra hard. And that's kind of understandable because you're normally in charge. You're normally kind of in control of how things should be and how things are going. And, you know, many people, many stakeholders, customers, investors expect you to be in charge. And so kind of asking for help may seem a sign of weakness, but we know that it's the smart thing to do. And actually in times of crisis, it's really a sign of strength. So if you kind of ask for support, then one way is kind of to frame these requests in a way that they're also more easily heard from the other side. So what we see is a lot of entrepreneurs have problems with payments or with customers getting materials, or kind of not, you know, needing to initiate conversations that payments will be late. And so these conversations we know are much easier to have when you frame it as a joint problem. So we're all in this together. The pandemic is not discriminating. And kind of emphasizing this as an opening, as a conversation starter is really helpful to then allow you together with your kind of counterpart to find really creative solutions. So this compared to kind of calling somebody up and saying, I can't pay, right? So rather kind of make it a conversation about what you both can do to help each other out in this situation. And you'd be surprised of how many open ears you'll encounter. It's also important to make this personal. So it's always easier to say no to an anonymous organization, much harder to say no to a person. And that make it personal also goes to how you communicate, right? So calling is better than writing, video calling is better than phone calling, even though, you know, we might not all be that comfortable with it. There's obviously also more formal ways of getting support. So there's a lot of government programs. It can be a bit hard to keep an overview, but the government website is actually quite useful. The barriers to applying to those things, I know that kind of we all hate to fill in forms, but the barriers are pretty low, and the support is out there for grabs, so kind of make use of it. And also don't forget your significant others and friends. We've heard in the first part from Cemek that social relationships really are an essential part for all our well-being, and they help us to detach from stress, from work. They also help sometimes to regain perspective on what really matters. And again, it can be difficult, but I was surprised personally how useful it is to actually set up Skype meetings when you can't see friends or colleagues. And I was surprised that it did almost feel like, you know, you were in the same room. So technology helps there as well. So we talked about kind of making time for recovery. We talked about seeking and utilizing support. And the kind of last element is to improvise and plan. And that's really kind of to help regain control. So kind of the golden rule is to accept what you cannot change, but then change what you can. So that kind of goes into what I said in the beginning. Accept that the situation is difficult and you won't be able to change certain things. There is an economic downturn. There's nothing anybody can do about that, unfortunately, not at least none of us. And so kind of instead of focusing on that and kind of thinking what might have been or what could be very specifically focused on the concrete things you can change. And that for your organization might be counterintuitively to try and do things in new ways, to improvise and explore. So what we see actually across the board is that firms are often inclined to react to crisis by wait and see, right? So the situation is so uncertain at the moment, so overwhelming, it's not really clear what could be done. So we'll just take a step back and wait and see how it develops. What we actually see in terms of entrepreneurs who successfully navigate crisis is that they don't do that. They don't wait and see. Instead, they try and improvise and try and experiment with business models, with their offerings, see if they can reach new markets, new customers. They're also very good in reaching out to business partners to see whether they can work together in new ways. And in our long-term study, which included the recession, the 2008-2009 recession period, it was really those entrepreneurs who quite early on tried to do things differently, try and explore, adapt, who were much more successful getting through the crisis in a good manner. And this can be hard when, you know, things are quite on the downhill, but it's worth doing and trying, and not every attempt will succeed. Again, this is kind of the aspect of be compassionate with yourself. Don't put additional pressure on it, but it is worth trying because we know this really helps to get through the crisis, get your business through the crisis. And then for you personally, it's also important to kind of reestablish the sense of control. Again, going back to what stress is. Stress really is this feeling that you're overwhelmed, that you don't have enough, enough capabilities, enough resources to deal with what's coming your way. And it's actually the little things that make a difference. So establish work routines that gives you a sense of control because you at least, you know what's happening next. It's also useful to kind of think a little bit about the time after the crisis, plan some positive events, can be little things, can be, meeting your family, but something that gives you a positive outlook for the future, something to look forward to. And collectively, all these things kind of then move you in the right direction and support your well-being. So this is kind of the summary. So acknowledging stress, making time for recovery, seeking support, improvising, and engaging in a little bit of planning. These are the 4 elements that really help you get you through the crisis safe and sound. And then I guess ultimately the 5th element is to take the long-term view. And I realized just how difficult that may sound if your business is in trouble at the moment. But people who fundamentally believe that crises are a learning opportunity and that, once you accept that they're stressful, but there still might be something positive in there. So if you can kind of take this lens and see it as something meaningful that allows you to be a better entrepreneur in the future, then that really is kind of a very successful mindset to adopt and a very resilient mindset. And I put here a quote from an entrepreneur who suffered quite dramatically in the 2009 crisis. And I think it nicely sums up what the long-term view could also be. So he used to be like, my work is me. And then you fail and you find out that your kids still love you, your wife still loves you, and your dog still loves you. And it's indeed these little things actually, well, family, but also other little things that help you to get you through the crisis. So this is a picture from my Sunday walk. Alpacas are nearby here. And getting out in nature and seeing something positive, the animals couldn't care less whether there's an economic downturn, kind of helps to just put a little bit of sunshine into your life. So I like to kind of make a bit more space for questions, and I've seen that there are some, and I'm going to give over to Pierre-Jean.
Yes, thank you, Ute. We have a question from Tamsin, wondering if you have any tips to maintain well-being when you are living on your own and when your company you're running is basically with different partners, everybody is remote and the crisis exacerbating the situation.
Yeah. That sounds really quite tough. I guess the little thing can be even just have regular update calls with your colleagues and make them, like this video chats. It's surprising how how that makes you feel better just to see the other people. I guess, and yeah, I really appreciate living alone is kind of a tough setting in this regard. There is social media, which, if used wisely, can really be quite a nice means of support, and kind of getting to talk to people, making this call. I find that in this time when everybody goes really through a tough time, it seems that people are much more open to be called again. So I spoke recently to friends that I haven't been speaking to for over a year, maybe sometimes longer. And just because there is the crisis and we all feel a bit lonely where we are, it was so much easier to reach out to them. So kind of, have the courage to take the first step, I guess, is what I'm saying as well here.
We have another question from Tarkan, whether you could recommend any entrepreneurs forum.
Oh, that's a good question. I can't. You might actually be able to recommend one, Pierre-Jean. Sorry to put you on the spot there.
I think that there are lots of forums, and ultimately it's a bit of matchmaking, and it's more about trying, testing, and see what works for you. Sometimes you have to choose by different theme, sometimes by industry, sometimes the type of people or nationality. There are different mixes, and ultimately it's more about finding what really works for you. So in a typical entrepreneur's mindset is, build, measure, learn, right? Just have your assumption about what you would like to get out of a forum, and then just experiment and see if it works or not, and keep iterating.
Yeah, I have nothing to add to that. That's a very good summary of what I would have said as well. Yeah.
And we have also a question from Nicholas. Saying that I'm teaching a startup seminar. What are your suggestions? I could tell my students, how can they best implement strategies to reduce stress and increase well-being from the startup moment and prior period on?
Yeah, that's actually a good question, a discussion I have quite frequently with my own students as well. I think it's about building in this time for recovery and appreciating that you need this time. I think that's already a big step. And then if I had to just make two recommendations, so the first one would be make sure that you build in time for recovery, and you acknowledge that you need this time. Even if you are very young and full of energy, you soon run out of energy because starting a business is just quite stressful. And the other big thing I would recommend is, if you can, start in a team, because if you have a business partner, maybe not so much a team, because depending on how well you know each other, a team can create also problems. But if you have one other person who goes through exactly the same thing you are going through, this one other person can be a tremendous source of social support. And over the years, all the entrepreneurs I got into the classroom, what they said was, what helped them through the most challenging times was their close business partner, if they had one, to the extent that some actually, a few years into their business, tried and developed partnerships so that they would feel less alone in what they were doing. Do we have any more questions?
Not at the moment. Again, please feel free to type your question in the chat.
I think there was a question if they can get the participants can get the video and audio recording of the webinar, and that's probably a question to our hosts.
Yes, so we need to check whether we're actually recording. What we can certainly offer is that we can share the slide set with you, and we also have a little 2-pager kind of summarizing with more resources of kind of tips and tricks, really. The thank you messages, that's great. Okay, yes, so we have a recording of the webinar which we will make available. Thank you very much, Tom and Izzy. if there are no more questions, I have 2 more slides left, 1 more slide really. So what we're doing at the moment is we are launching a global study of entrepreneurs' well-being and resilience. And so what you get from that, there is a survey to complete, but it would be really great if you shared your experiences with us through this, completing this survey. And at the end of the survey, you get kind of feedback on your specific resources to cope with stress and be resilient. So all comes out of validated research on entrepreneurs, and it's a feature that the feedback is from the entrepreneurs who completed it, they really enjoy. So it would be terrific if you could log on and kind of complete the survey so that you're part of our study, and we have over 22 countries at the moment signed up for this study. So it would be intriguing insights that we're of course happy to share with you. And last but not least, I want to say thank you very much for attending the seminar. Hopefully you've had some have some tips and tricks that help you to get through the crisis. And remember, it's the pandemic, it's not you. And stay well and stay safe. And I guess I can say also thank you on behalf of my colleagues, Pierre-Jean and Przemek. And you can see where you can reach us if you have more questions or want to follow up with something. Thank you very much for joining us today.